My wife and I were recently feeling the pressures and the effects of adulthood and all the burdens and responsibilities that come with it. And we felt like we needed some renewal and some refreshment in our relationships. So we did what all older millennials do, which is we watched Titanic together. And that inspired, at least in me, a renewed, albeit passing, interest in the historical events that led to the sinking of the Titanic, as well as the reaction to the tragedy in the aftermath, which is this routine that we rehearse every time something bad happens, where we pick ourselves back up from the grief and then we resolve to never let something like that happen again. But the way that we respond and address these tragedies and talk about them and what led to them underscores for me how remote we are from actually diagnosing the real problems that lead to such things. You'd think that the deaths of thousands of people would be shocking enough for us to just take our blindfolds off and to be willing to take a candid and penitential look at ourselves, but we don't seem to be, and as a result, we are therefore doomed to repeat these same mistakes. In the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust, the UN resolved to never let something like a genocide happen again, but of course, that hasn't stopped several large-scale genocides from taking place. Right now in Nigeria, there is an escalating situation of violence against Christians in that country, with so far no significant international response or even media coverage to alert us to the fact that this is going on to prevent it from getting worse. So in the case of the Titanic, like so many other problems that call out to us for solutions, they responded as if the main problem was a lack of rules and regulations. Like it's a systemic problem. We're always obsessing over the systemic issue at large here. Like there weren't enough safety standards or regulatory bodies. In other words, there wasn't enough bureaucracy to prevent such a terrible tragedy. But if after doing an inquiry and contemplating how a thing can go badly, the kinds of rules to be followed can seem fairly obvious to anybody with a rational mind, the question for me is, why weren't they obvious before the tragedy? And considering the multiple errors that accumulated to the disastrous sinking of the Titanic, anyone with a shred of common sense would say, maybe that's not a good idea. So when we ask the question, well, why did the Titanic sink and so many people die? If our answer is, well, the rudder was too small for the size of that boat, or they were traveling too fast in hazardous waters, or the sea was too calm and prevented lookouts from seeing waves breaking against hazards like icebergs, or that there wasn't enough lifeboats, and so on and on and on. Notice that all of those assessments and considerations are of a technical nature, and they should have been abundantly obvious to the technical people in charge of them, but for some reason they weren't. The inquiry about why the Titanic sunk shouldn't be an attempt to point out the obvious. It should be a more difficult inquiry into why the obvious wasn't obvious to impressively credentialed decision makers. And the answer and the real reason that it sunk, which should also be obvious, was because of arrogance. Arrogance led the decision makers to believe that the boat couldn't sink, and therefore conventional precautions, they just weren't necessary. Arrogance is a particular expression of pride that blinds us to our own weaknesses, our limitations, and our vulnerabilities. It insists that we think of ourselves and see ourselves as greater, more immutable, stronger, more powerful, and less limited than we actually are. And don't you notice something peculiar about all of those properties? Greatness, immutability, strength, power, unlimitedness. That all sounds a lot like God, doesn't it? Pride and arrogance are that particular persuasion within ourselves that tries to convince us that we are godlike. Pride convinces us of all kinds of things that aren't true about ourselves, which just so happen to be true of God. It is a spiritual disease which darkens our common sense and our intellects and urges us to act as rivals to God as well as to one another, rather than subjects of God and neighbors to our fellow man. It inspires a whole range of vices like jealousy, anger, greed, vanity, laziness, and lust. So returning to the sinking of the Titanic, they arrogantly believed something about their ability to use science and technology to overcome the obstacles of nature. They believed that something as immeasurably powerful as the Atlantic Ocean was no match for the miracles of human ingenuity through science. This was an early 20th century hangover from the Enlightenment, and if you read the way that Enlightenment philosophers talk about the coming scientific utopia and victory of man over nature, this kind of blind arrogance shouldn't really be surprising to us. Enlightenment philosopher Gottfried Leibniz, for example, once famously boasted that scientists were going to torture Mother Nature into submission on the rack until she revealed her secrets, which is right in line with thinkers like Bacon and Descartes, who are the founding fathers of what we consider to be the modern approach and technique of science, which is about dominating rather than cooperating with the natural world. Only a few centuries later, and they're boasting that the Titanic could not be sunk. Why? Not because it's impossible to sink, which any engineer could have demonstrated, and history has now proven, but because we had become so impressed with our own scientific achievements through the Industrial Revolution that we started to believe things about ourselves and our abilities which just weren't true. An extremely persuasive line of thinking near the end of the 19th century was this idea that reason and science would usher in an age of peace and prosperity, and that all of our problems would be solved by focusing our attention on what really matters, again, the natural sciences, rather than preoccupying ourselves with the excessive moralizing and superstition of religion. And Titanic was only a minor event, which should have reminded us how idiotic this infernal self-aggrandizing mood actually was. Instead, it took the bloodbath of the early 20th century for us to sober up from such a misplaced and arrogant optimism. World War I taught us that not only is science and technology not going to save us from our problems, but that we were capable of taking those scientific achievements and turning them against ourselves on a horrific scale. Kurt Vonnegut once remarked that he was convinced that scientific truth was going to make everyone happy and healthy. And then what actually happened was that they dropped scientific truth on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The fact is, human beings have serious moral weaknesses that, when ignored, cloud our judgment and darken our intellects. It convinces us to ignore our defects and to place our hope in solutions that are not only not real moral solutions, but may even be the means to our own destruction. This is the fundamental nature of pride. Pride is not something to be celebrated. It is the root of that human weakness and self-imposed ignorance. It's what can cause an otherwise brilliant engineer or naval captain to make obviously stupid decisions that imperil the lives of thousands of people. It breeds injustice, rivalry, jealousy, and greed. And if you want to end tragedies like the sinking of the Titanic, or wars, or school shootings, or environmental destruction, and whatever else we might decry, instead of looking outside of ourselves at technical problems or regulatory problems, we should be looking inwardly at our own predisposition to be so impressed with ourselves to such a degree that we ignore all common sense and the abundantly obvious warning signs that say, hey, maybe you shouldn't be doing that. Humility is the antidote. Humility is what we should be celebrating in the streets and designing flags and crosswalks to commemorate. Humility would have said it's possible that the Titanic can actually sink, and that we should be more cautious, go a little slower, put some lifeboats on there, and take emergencies seriously when they occur, because we are vulnerable, we are limited, and we are prone to mistakes, and we are morally foolish at times. And now, a century later, amnesia has set in, and we're celebrating pride and all of our worst traits with the same kind of arrogance and disregard for the fact that we have nothing to be proud of. Wow, you have certain appetites that you aren't capable of correcting or resisting. You could look at that and say, hey, maybe this is a regrettable part of my experience or my psychology, and it's something that I should work on correcting. But instead, we double down on insisting that there's nothing wrong with us, and instead we should actually light up all the engines and sail as fast as possible towards our own destruction.
Hey, thanks for watching. The reason I can continue making content like this is because of the generous support of my viewers. If you are able to support the work I'm doing, there are a couple of ways you can do that: by donating through my website or by joining my online community, The Reinforcements. Both can be done by visiting brianholdsworth.ca, the .ca because that's how we intranet in Canada. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe. And again, thanks for watching.